Jen! Jenna! Mike paced back and forth, Jenna's cell phone in his hand, peering frantically into the mess of half-bare autumn trees along the rural road as he called for his daughter. Worry began to set into his stomach as he neither heard nor saw any reply. Jenna! He screamed out in fear of what may have happened to her. But as he did, he heard a strange noise that startled him. He stopped to listen carefully and realised the sound was coming from his pocket. He remembered then that he hadn't ended the call on his cell phone when he left the house to look for Jenna, so he quickly dove his empty hand into his pocket to grab his phone. Bringing it up to his ear, he heard the same garbled static that he had heard when Jenna's phone called his. He lowered the phone from his ear and looked at the screen. It still said that it was connected to Jenna's call. However, when he looked at Jenna's phone, the screen was black, as if it was turned off. He tried pressing buttons on her phone, but nothing gave any response until he held down the power button, which then did nothing but end the call on his phone. Hers stayed black, and furthermore unresponsive. He tried to dial her number from his phone, but instead of a ringing tone, he heard still the same distortion as before, while her phone remained dead. Confusion began to settle in the pit of his stomach, along with fear and worry, and he started to feel physically sick. His gut churned and he quickly turned back to his car and got back into the driver's seat, throwing both of the phones into the passenger seat before taking off down the road, continuing towards where Alex and Abby lived. Coming to another screeching halt in the driveway of the Morgans' house, he fought back the urge to hurl as he saw the twins sitting on the porch with no sign of his daughter. He headed towards them without even closing the car door, and they could immediately tell that something was wrong. "What's wrong, Mr. Landros?" Abby asked as both of them stood up, concern setting in on their faces. "Where is Jenna? Please tell me she's here with you," Mike replied, almost in tears at this point. "She headed for home like a half hour ago." "She should have been there by now," Alex replied from behind Abby, before stepping forward as his sister started to panic, as well as realization started to come to her mind. She called me from her cell phone. I couldn't hear anything, but then Mike stammered as he fought back tears of worry, and Abby started crying as she saw how he was reacting. He turned and headed back to the car, reaching in for both of the phones. He then headed back towards Alex and Abby and handed his phone to Alex. He then showed him that hers was unresponsive to anything that he did to it. "That's weird." "That's weird. Why is it doing that?" Alex asked. "Now call her phone with mine," Mike responded. Alex raised an eyebrow questioningly, but did as he was instructed anyways. After dialing the number, he raised the phone to his ear to hear the same thing Mike had heard, and almost dropped the phone out of shock. "What is it?" Abby asked, not knowing what was going on. Alex turned to look at her and paused a moment, hesitating, before looking back down at the phone and turning on the speakerphone for her to hear. She gasped, covering her mouth and stepping backwards, almost tripping over her chair as she freaked out at what she was hearing. "What happened, Mike?" Alex asked as he looked back at him, the distortion in the phone line still blaring over the speakerphone. "What is this? Where's Jenna?" he demanded. I don't know. She told me she was coming over here and then she called me, but it was all just this," he said as he motioned to put his phone in Alex's hand. "I couldn't hear anything but that until I heard her scream. I got in the car to look for her. Her phone was just laying in the middle of the road." His eyes began to fill with tears as he saw Abby's knees buckle under her as she listened to what he was saying, her tears turning into sobs as she buried her face in her palms as she sat in the chair. "Where on the road?" Alex said again, his voice strict and harsh. About halfway between here and our home. I looked for her. I called for her. Mike couldn't hold back his tears anymore as the static in the line screeched and garbled over the sound of him and Abby crying. It was deafening to him, as his mind threatened to break as much as his heart was, until finally Alex turned off the phone in his hands. He then turned around and headed into the house. "What are you doing?" Abby asked from her porch seat as she turned to look in the window behind her, tears still rolling down her face. Mike wasn't able to hear Alex's reply, but after a few minutes, Alex came back out and gave him the answer. "The police are on their way. They told me to hold onto both cell phones," he said as he reached out a hand to Mike, motioning for Jenna's phone. Mike wiped at the tears on his face, though more continued to fall, and he handed her phone to him without knowing what to say. Alex, now with both phones in his hands, headed back to his seat on the porch and sat down to wait for the police. He looked over at his sister, who was still crying, with a heavy sigh before looking back towards Mike, watching him as if he was expecting him to do something. However, Mike could only stare at the spot on the pavement that was turning darker as his tears soaked into it, his mind trying to take in everything that had happened. What is that? That humming sound, it sounds familiar. Wait, no! Jenna realised what she was hearing as she thought to herself, and jolted up from where she laid. It was the same vibration of the ship's motor that she had heard in one of her supposed dreams. Only this time, she knew for certain that it was no dream. She looked around at her surroundings, her eyes quickly scanning over every single thing that she could see. It was exactly as it was in the dreams, but she was in a different room. This one was smaller and more enclosed. There was no large window, and much to her temporary relief, no cloaked beings. Her mild relief, though, was quickly abolished, as she soon realised that the room she was in resembled a futuristic operation room, and she had been lying on a metal table with a thin silver sheet of an unknown material covering all but her face. She quickly threw the sheet off of her and realised that underneath it, she was naked. Jumping off the table, she started to look around the room for her clothes, panicking at the thought of what might have happened to her. In the middle of searching for her clothing, she heard a noise coming from behind her. It sounded like a hydraulic door opening and closing. Startled by the sound as she remembered the hooded being that had walked up to her in one of her dreams, she dove back towards the table she woke up on, grabbing the silver sheet on the way. She threw it around her bare body and ducked down behind the table, hiding behind the thick base of it. Trembling in fear, she tried to hold her breath to prevent anyone or anything from hearing her, but she was sure that her pounding heart could be heard from 10 feet away. Then she felt a hand on her shoulder. She jumped out of surprise and screamed, but her scream was cut short as she slammed her head into the underside of the table from jumping. She rushed both hands up to grab the back of her head in pain, the silver sheet falling down as she let go of it. At this point, though, she didn't care. Her mind immediately started telling herself that this was it. She was going to die. Tears started gushing out of her eyes as she pulled herself into a fetal position, under the table, still holding her head, half out of the pain throbbing through it, half out of fear. But then she heard a gentle feminine voice. "Are you okay?" The voice spoke in perfect English. "Are you hurt?" Jenna froze as she heard the voice, and then realised that there were two bare, pale-skinned, normal-sized human feet on the floor in front of her. She slowly lowered her hands from her head and looked up as far as she could see from under the table. The feet were attached to skinny and pale but otherwise normal human-looking bare legs. "It's okay. You can come out," the voice assured her. She hesitated for what seemed to her like forever, though, until she saw the knees bend and the rest of the body come into view as the woman knelt down. She looked like a fairly normal human in her mid-30s, and her full nudity showed that she was all over built, very skinny, and her skin looked as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. Almost equally as pale hair was tied back behind her head, and her ice blue eyes seemed to nearly glow as she looked at Jenna, concern on her face. "Come on." "I won't hurt you," she assured Jenna again as she reached a hand out to her. Jenna shifted slightly in uneasiness, pressing her back against the table base, but the woman saw the reaction and pulled her hand back away from Jenna, letting her have space. Jenna let out a small sigh and finally crawled out from under the table, wrapping the sheet back around her as she stood up and looked at the woman, who now was also stood up. "Who are you?" Jenna asked the woman as she made sure to keep some distance between them. "And where am I? What am I doing here?" The woman smiled softly to Jenna as she replied, "You are on Jar-Zar. You were brought here because you have something very important to do, and I have been assigned to help guide you through it. My name is Michaela Joel."